Hello, I'm Maria Hall Brown, and this is LA Currents. Well, an advisor provides guidance, support, resources, and today we have someone who is quite the amazing advisor. I'm delighted to be joined today by the Los Angeles City Administrative Officer, Matt Szabo. Nice to have you here. Thank you so much for being here. All right, so I just gave you this huge responsibility in terms of the City of Los Angeles and your office advising the mayor and the city council, but literally, what are the parameters of the office? Because it seems very, very complicated looking out, looking in.
Right, well, thank you. It's very nice to be here. The primary job of the CAO is to be the principal financial advisor to the mayor and the council. So we, in that area of responsibility, we assist the mayor in developing the annual budget. We assist the council in reviewing and approving the annual budget. We are responsible for making revenue projections for the various sources of revenue that the city brings in, and we bring in a number of sources of revenue, not just property tax, but business tax, sales tax, hotel tax, et cetera. We need to make projections on that. We monitor how the revenue is coming in versus plan. We also manage our debt portfolio, any of the bonds that we issue for construction, usually for major construction projects. We also, because City of Los Angeles is the majority of the money we spend is on employees to deliver services, police, firefighters, rec assistants, et cetera. 80% of what we spend is on employees. Okay. We also are responsible for negotiating the salaries, wages, and benefits for all of the city's employees. In addition to that, we have responsibility over the finance side of our homelessness portfolio. Last year spent $1.3 billion on homelessness. This year we're going to spend just over $1 billion on homelessness, and so I have a unit in my office that manages that. And then we have several departments that work with, or several groups in the office that work with departments as the department's financial advisor, working with them on their budgets, making sure that they're on track. And that's the kind of the big picture, and we're also involved in, of course, major policy decisions, because almost every policy decision that the city council and the mayor make has financial implications.
That's an enormous amount of information that I'm sure you have to gather, organize, understand, cull, and share. But even the best laid plans obviously have outside factors that work into it. And right now, it's not a big surprise, but the city's in a fiscal crisis. So what is happening in that regard? Where are we based on what was planned for and hoped for, and now what is actually happening?
Sure. So there's a couple of factors, a couple of major factors that are contributing to the city's current financial status. And principally, it is, I would argue that we are still in the echo of the impact of what happened during the COVID pandemic. And what I mean by that, yes, the pandemic is behind us, thankfully, but it had such a significant impact on the economy that the corresponding and subsequent inflation that took place after the shutdown, that built up demand, that built up savings, that also restricted supply, and then we had an overabundance of demand and not enough supply, a dearth of supply, and that led to significant inflation. The federal government comes in and increases interest rates in an effort to slow the economy, and that has worked. Inflation has come down, but at the expense of lower levels of spending. So the city, of course, our main source of revenue is property tax, but we also receive significant revenue from business tax, from sales tax, from hotel taxes, from taxes on sales of property. And so when you have high inflation and the cost of money is higher, we are seeing a softening. Consumer behavior is reacting to those conditions. So business tax is flattened or gone below projections. Sales tax is below projections. Of course, the high interest rates has essentially frozen the housing market, and so our transfer taxes are significantly down. There is good news on those fronts. Inflation is down, interest rates are down, so the runway looks good. The economic indicators are good for the city, but for right now, we're having to deal with softening revenue at a time that we've also seen upward pressure on wages. And you've seen it all across sectors, from Hollywood to the teachers to UPS. When costs are higher, that puts upward pressure on wages, and that also means it has put upward pressure on wages for city employees. So we've had to work to provide compensation scales that ensure that our employees are paid competitively at the same time as revenue has softened. And that's the principal struggle. In addition to that, we've seen very significant increases in liability payouts.
I was going to ask about that.
And that is people suing the city for various reasons. Sometimes, many of them are from LAPD for use of force. Many of them are employment cases where that's internal to the city. Many of them are tragic incidents, car crashes, or other dangerous conditions on city streets, roads, sidewalks, and the city is sued as a result. And those have skyrocketed, more than doubled over the past 2 years. Over the past several years, the city would pay out about $100 million in liability, and that seems, that's a huge amount to pay annually, $100 million of taxpayer money in lawsuit costs. But we have an $8 billion budget, and so that was relatively manageable. Last year it was over $200 million. It is only October this year, and we've already spent over $260 million, whereas we had budgeted the $100 million that had been basically what it has cost us over the past several years. So that is putting a significant pressure on our reserve fund at a time when we are working to balance the higher prices of our employee compensation, the higher cost of employee compensation, with softening revenue.
So what happens if, in fact, you get to the crisis stage? Because there's actually a threshold, a percentage threshold, that if the fund drops below 2.8%, what happens? What decisions have to be made at that point in order to rectify the financials? What areas of support are in danger of being lost or affected or impacted?
Well, as we started this conversation about the roles of the CAO,
right.
Budget control is a critical and principal role. But what I mean by budget control is it isn't just about setting an annual budget, but it's about making assessments and providing recommendations to the mayor and the council over the course of the year to make corrections
Sure.
if we're off course. So we will be making recommendations to the mayor and the council on strategies to protect the reserve fund, to grow the reserve fund back up to our financial policy minimum of 5%. There are various ways we can do that. Principally, we just need to stay within budget. Year over year, departments often have needs for additional spending beyond what was in the budget. We're simply not in a position to do that this year. There may need to be some reductions in other areas. That'll be a conversation that we have with the mayor and the council. We'll make proposals, but ultimately the elected officials will decide. But it all comes down to priorities, and it is the case that given our current revenue picture, we're not in a position to expand service in all areas.
Sure.
There, as you cited, the mayor and the council made a decision that it was important to be able to expand, or at least hire up to the authorized level at LAPD.
Mm-hmm.
LAPD has been losing officers
Right.
For the last several years, and now whereas it was in 2020, At 10,000, it is now below 9,000, and that also, by the way, although it does yield savings, savings to the city when we're paying for fewer officers. Because you have fewer officers, it also puts upward pressure on overtime. So you have fewer officers working more hours.
Right.
Overtime is time and a half. So that doesn't work for the city financially either. So the mayor and council made a decision to compensate officers in a manner commensurate with our surrounding agencies. That was also a very expensive decision, but it was also a policy decision. And the same goes for the level of compensation to our civilian employees. Those were essentially policy decisions. So what we are able to do beyond that, until the revenue picture turns around, will be limited, and so we'll make recommendations to the mayor and the council as to what it is that we are able to do. Ultimately, they'll make the decision, make the choices, the policy choices as to what they would like to do with our limited resources.
Is there a way that you outline all of this? Money that we thought we were going to spend, money that we have to spend, money that we're not going to spend even though we wanted to spend it? I mean, how is it organized?
Yeah, so we provide comprehensive reports to the council and the mayor on a quarterly basis. They're called financial status reports. That gives as best a picture as we can give as to where we are on our plan in terms of revenue and expenditures, and then it makes recommendations on adjustments that would be required. In some cases, it will recommend reductions. In some cases, it will recommend increasing funds or transferring funds from other areas. That, by the way, is the issue. You would ask the question, well, why do we care about the reserve fund? The reserve fund is there to take care of contingencies. There's always going to be reasons that you need to spend more money than you expect. Emergencies arise. There can be over expenditures in areas like overtime because we haven't hired as much as we have, and so our overtime costs are going to be more than anticipated. And we need a contingency. It's a important part of any sound financial plan to have a significant contingency. Sure. And so we will not only make recommendations to stay on our budget plan, but we will also make recommendations to build our reserve back up to that 5%. We clearly need to do work with policymakers and the city attorney to make investments in the areas where we are seeing the highest number of lawsuits and payouts due to judgments and settlements. We do control, and we should look at making greater investments in our public infrastructure. We need to look at making greater investments in employee and management training. If we're spending tens of millions of dollars a year on employment cases, we need to look at how our managers and our employees are being trained, and if they need to be trained at a higher level. And then we need to hold people accountable for operating appropriately in a public agency.
There's no reason you should actually have the answer to this question, but perhaps you do, so I'm going to ask. For all these liability cases that you're referencing, whether it be employment, LAPD, or something that has happened on city property, do we think that somebody has caught on to the idea that the city is a good route to get money, that they, AKA, always go for the deep pocket? Or is there really an observation that there are areas that the city has not paid attention to and that's why it's happening? Or has the court just given up and not even worried about it because it's just overwhelmed, and anytime somebody brings something in, then okay, what do you want? I'll give you half of it and I'll go.
Yeah, so I can't really characterize the motives of plaintiffs.
Got it.
But what I can say is we are seeing a definite trend in the magnitude of the settlements and the judgments. And again, going back to that demarcation mark of COVID, typically a settlement with facts that may be legitimate, and that would yield a settlement amount of $500,000 is now or a judgment amount of $2 million may be yielding a judgment amount of $10 million today. And the city, oftentimes people see the city as it's a giant organization, and as you said, deep pockets. So it's easier, perhaps, to render larger judgments. That also puts upward pressure on settlement amounts as well. And that's just not the case. I mean, these are taxpayer dollars that otherwise would go to providing city services. And when you think about that, it's not just some opaque government. It's what does the city do? The city provides police, provides firefighters, provides everything. If you walk outside and if you essentially look at anything that isn't privately owned, that's the city. The trees, the sidewalks, the street lights, the roads, the crosswalks. The city is all responsible for that. The basic city services, the parks, the zoo, the libraries, and we do need to look at strategies to ensure that we're not spending so much money on lawsuits, so that we can direct those dollars towards those basic services.
You have been in public service for a very long time. You've been with a lot of different offices, and now you're in this particular office. What is it about being part of the city and the workings of the city that drew you in the first place and keeps you motivated? Because as things go on, are more complicated, more expectations. The city is very unique in its just being, and there's a lot of hope for the future. What is it about it that drew you into the city? And you've worked with several mayors, and most recently Mayor Garcetti before working in this office. What is it that got you involved, and why are you here?
Well, as it relates to government, I think it's such a privilege to work in local government because you have the opportunity to literally see and feel the results of your work in a way that you may not at the federal level, where you're working on multi-year policies or foreign policy. And well, I'm not comparing what's better or worse. It's just it's a benefit of working in local government. What people care about in their day-to-day lives, is it safe to get to work? What does our street look like? Do we have a safe park to go to? Is the fire department going to respond when we call? The basic everyday quality of life issues is what the city of LA is ultimately responsible for, and so the work that we do, the budgets that we put together, the projects that we approve, you could actually see the results of those almost immediately, or at least immediately in government time.
Which is a little bit longer than immediately, but you're right. I understand.
You know what I mean. So that's what drew me to local government, and this particular office. I mean, I've been working on budgets really since 2008, and have been in the middle of multiple administrations, and so of course the CAO is really in the middle of almost everything in the city, and particularly financially. So it's a privilege to be in this role.
And you've watched a lot of change in the city. I mean, obviously, we mentioned the pandemic before, at the very beginning, but even prior to that, and now post-pandemic, and different legislations, different council perspectives, everything like that. How do you feel about the city of Los Angeles? Is it moving in the right direction? Are you optimistic, or do we have some work to do ahead of us, and everybody's really aiming that way?
Well, I'm definitely optimistic. I mean, I do think we're moving in the right direction. Clearly, the city has a lot of challenges, but there are significant opportunities. Obviously, we have the Olympics coming in 2028. We've got the Super Bowl in 27, the World Cup in 26. LA is, in so many ways, the center of the universe for an urban center. not just in this country, but on the planet. And again, it's a privilege to work in a city that means so much to so many. And yes, it's recovering from COVID, has presented challenges as it has across the country, particularly in downtowns. But this is a resilient city, and we know where we need to go. We've got great leadership from the mayor and the council. There is a focus on dealing with and addressing homelessness like there has never been, and a commitment to solving the crisis. And that really is, in my view, the key to unlocking the potential of the city. And I think the commitment is there, and I think that we'll get there. So I am optimistic.
But that is a double-edged sword, because we've actually outpriced ourselves. I mean, you talk about the fact that property taxes are one of the ways that the city gets income, and our property is unbelievably valuable, but that means that so many people can't afford our property. And then the issue of being able to create homes for those that need more affordable homes take a while, and that's a long process. So, we've kind of set ourselves up into this very strange scenario of, we're very expensive, very fabulous, we have all these great things, but that means that we also don't have the ability to balance that with a more general populace. So that's where the questions come in. I mean, what are we doing to address that? Obviously, the situation with the homelessness, but I mean, does your office have any conversation in that regard about?
Well, we're not responsible. We're
I know you're not responsible
directly for housing, but I will just say there is more of a commitment and more of a funding commitment to develop more affordable housing in the city than there has been, than there ever has been. We do have a dedicated tax revenue that we had not had prior to 2022. That is bringing in hundreds of millions of dollars for affordable housing, and we have built, are in process of building 10,000 units for the formerly unhoused. So there are strategies in place to make Los Angeles more affordable. It does come down to housing stock. We just, as we had the conversation about supply and demand, that is also part of it. We need more supply to ease the upward pressure on prices to make LA more affordable. That's absolutely true, and that's at the center of the mayor and council's priorities. So, although actually we have a housing department that deals with that, our office plays a support role on that, but that's that is critical.
But you do oversee the monies that are spent by the city on organizations that help the unhoused and the homeless. And so, having looked at those reports and seeing who's doing what and how much they're spending on what and how much impact that's having, do you ever take that information and say, this group is spending too much money on employees, this group is not doing enough with the amount of money that we're giving them, this organization seems to be doing a lot of direct to client service versus this group seems to be doing a lot of planning and strategizing? And do you have any oversight or say in that regard? So
we have. So in terms of the services that we provide to the unhoused, we do work through a joint powers authority, the Los Angeles Homeless Services Authority. They manage all of the contracts to all the service providers. We have a relationship with them. It is the case that because we have built out a system that has from the beginning been a response to a crisis. Homelessness is inherently a crisis for the person experiencing homelessness, and our response system has been built almost as a crisis response more than it has been built out to be a system. We are changing that and looking at establishing a standardized scope of services that the service providers would be required to provide for a standardized rate, so that we know and will be able to better assess what we're getting for the dollars that we're spending. We're going through that process now. Just like, it's expensive. The type of work that we need, the care for individuals that have an array of challenges to get them from the street to interim housing and then ready to move into permanent housing requires significant investment. And so that's why, as I said, it does come down to increasing the supply so that we can move as many people as we can into permanent housing, because that process of moving folks from the street to interim housing and caring for them in interim housing is very expensive. So we are looking at ways, particularly under the leadership of the chair of our Housing and Homelessness Committee, Councilmember Rahman, in making that process more efficient and holding our service providers more accountable for quicker turnaround, and so that we can move people from the street to interim housing to permanent housing quicker, because the longer that they're in interim housing, the more we're spending without seeing the benefit.
Right. And I can't let you go without asking you, obviously you have a great deal of compassion for humanity. You spent some time as a young man working in an orphanage in Mexico. What was that experience? What prompted you, and how did that impact your thoughts in moving forward and working in the public sector?
Yeah, I did. That was a long time ago. It was right after I graduated from undergrad, and I wanted to do something different. I didn't want to just jump into grad school, and what drew me to it, I wanted to do something hard. The orphanage that I worked at had over 1,000 kids. It was a very large site on a former sugarcane plantation, and I was responsible for the time that I was there for a year, working with other staff who were there for 66 kids that were in one dorm room. There was a school on site. There was a farm on site. There were farm animals, all of that. It was fairly self-sufficient. It was a great experience. It was hard work. I learned, I didn't go down there to think that I was going to do anything to help people. I learned, I think I learned much more from them than they learned from me. So it was a good experience. I actually am in touch with a lot of those kids who are not kids anymore at all. Some of them are in their 40s now. So, keep touch with them on social media. But yeah, it was a great experience.
Wow, interesting. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. And if people want to learn more about the city administrative officer and what happens within, and because I've asked a lot of questions, but there's so much more. We didn't get to even a third of what I wanted to talk to you about, because what we were talking about really was powerful. So if people want to learn more, what's the best way for them to understand what's happening in your office?
They can go to our city website, which is cao.lacity.gov.
Okay, thank you. And that's a wrap on this LA Currents.